Part 1. The Strange Truth About Dating Customs in Medieval Times. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with a little journey back into the slightly awkward, mostly uncomfortable world of medieval dating. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket if you like, and let's float slowly into a time when love was, well, a little more complicated than swiping left or right. Now, when we talk about dating in medieval Europe, it's not really dating in the sense you're thinking. There weren't coffee shops or awkward first messages on an app. No, dating back then was more like a chessboard of social, political, and sometimes vaguely terrifying rituals. Imagine arranging a lifelong partnership with someone you've mostly seen in paintings and church sermons. Romantic, right? Let's start with courtship, which was basically a performance of wealth, patience, and often a tolerable level of boredom. If you were lucky enough to be nobility, the whole idea of wooing someone was less, hey, I like your smile, and more, hey, I can provide a dowry, protect your lands, and also tolerate your extended family. Because, of course, what young maiden wouldn't dream of having her fate decided by contracts and livestock negotiations? One of the more interesting aspects of medieval dating was the ritual of gift-giving. And when I say gift-giving, think less bouquet of flowers and more, here I brought you a small deer and some fine cloth from my estate. Yes, nothing says romance like livestock delivered to your front gate, accompanied by a squire who probably smells faintly of horse. Noble suitors often wrote elaborate love letters as well. They were frequently long, poetic, and entirely one-sided. If the object of affection responded at all, it was usually with a carefully worded note ensuring that while your feelings were noted, they were also, unfortunately, irrelevant. But hey, that's love, medieval edition. Speaking of letters, courtly love was a kind of informal medieval culture of emotional theater. This was mostly practiced among the upper classes, and it involved a lot of sighing, composing awkward poems, and maybe a few stolen glances over banquet tables. Courtly love had rules, like the sacred adore from afar principle. You were expected to pine publicly, but never actually take action. It was like a very slow, socially sanctioned version of texting someone repeatedly without ever calling. And yes, some of these noble loves were entirely platonic. They'd write love poetry to someone they never planned to marry because, well, again, romance was mostly about social performance, not actual compatibility. Now, let's float over to the matchmaking process itself, which was often conducted by parents, relatives, and occasionally a well-intentioned but slightly overzealous priest. This was partly to preserve alliances, strengthen political ties, or combine estates. Love, in the personal sense, was considered optional. You might end up marrying someone who was, in modern terms, basically a stranger with a vaguely interesting family tree. The more inbred your prospective spouse was, the better. At least that was the thinking in certain circles. Royal families were obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, which, as we'll see later in the series, didn't always go so well. The engagement period was another peculiar institution. Unlike modern engagements, which are usually just a brief waiting period, medieval engagements could last years. During this time, the couple might meet once in a while at public events or through carefully supervised visits. Most of the time, however, they communicated through letters, intermediaries, and occasional awkward staring contests across castle halls. The engagement itself was legally binding. Breaking it was a scandal, punishable in various ways depending on your social class. For the average noble, this often meant forced apologies, loss of dowry, or social exile. Romantic spontaneity was definitely frowned upon. Now, let's drift now to some of the stranger customs that crop up when we look at medieval matchmaking. There's something called the bridal lottery, which existed in certain regions. This was exactly what it sounds like. Unmarried women of a certain social tier could be drawn to marry eligible bachelors in the village. Naturally, this was less about love and more about property and economic balance. You might end up married to someone you barely knew, in a home you didn't own, with a family that expected you to act cheerfully regardless of your personal feelings. And the bonus? If you refused, your reputation was ruined. Again, medieval romance, equal parts fate and mild terror. In other parts of Europe, there was a ritual known as troth plighting, which was the medieval equivalent of exchanging engagement rings. Except instead of sparkling diamonds, it might involve symbolic objects like a belt, a glove, or a small token of craftsmanship. These items carried legal weight. To give someone your glove was basically saying, "I am legally attached to you now, so don't even think about dating your neighbor." Troth plighting could be performed publicly or privately, and breaking it was considered a serious social faux pas. It's kind of like giving someone a lifetime subscription to your emotional life, whether you were ready or not. Of course, not everyone followed these formal rules. Peasant courtship was in many ways simpler, but equally odd. Folk traditions often included elaborate dances, singing contests, and sometimes competitions of endurance or skill. Imagine a medieval version of karaoke combined with obstacle courses, where your eligibility as a romantic partner depended on how well you could sing or jump over hay bales. Charming in its rough way, but also exhausting if you were on the short end of the talent pool. There was also a rather grim, if mildly amusing, custom called trial marriages. In some areas, couples could live together for a year and a day before the union was considered permanent. If the arrangement didn't work out, either party could leave without legal consequence. This sounds almost progressive for medieval times, but the details were tricky. Communities sometimes imposed pressure on the couple to continue the marriage regardless of compatibility. And because inheritance and property were often involved, you could still face social consequences if you left. Still, it was probably one of the few ways medieval people could date with some degree of choice. And now, a brief note on medieval romance in literature versus reality. Courtly literature often painted love as tragic, poetic, and eternal. The actual lives of people were usually less glamorous. For example, a knight might serenade a lady for months, while simultaneously managing debt, feuding neighbors, and the occasional outbreak of plague. The lady in question might have been more concerned about getting enough grain for winter than reading the sonnets meant for her. Reality, it turns out, had a very inconvenient habit of interfering with romance. Speaking of inconvenient realities, dowries and bride prices were central to the dating experience. A dowry was basically property, money, or goods that a bride brought into a marriage. Sometimes this was a small estate, sometimes livestock, or even jewelry that had been in the family for generations. If you were particularly unlucky, you might end up with a dowry so large that your spouse viewed you as a walking bank account rather than a romantic partner. Conversely, a small or missing dowry could doom a match, regardless of affection. Economic considerations were the backbone of most medieval unions, making love an optional, decorative accessory. One of the quirkiest customs was the first night myth. Popular culture often imagines medieval lords exercising some kind of right to spend the first night with a bride. In reality, historical evidence for this is slim, but folklore abounds. What's more certain is that consummation of marriage was socially scrutinized. Families wanted proof that heirs could be produced, which added a level of awkward pressure no modern relationship would ever tolerate. And finally, let's touch on romantic rejection, which was as complicated then as it is now, only slower. If you rejected someone of equal or higher status, it could spark scandal or even feuds. Rejecting a lower status suitor was safer, but could still lead to gossip. People often had to navigate these situations with extreme care, using letters, intermediaries, or carefully worded public statements. Subtlety and patience were the hallmarks of rejection. A harsh no could ruin your life, while a polite avoidance could simply ruin your week. So, there we have it. Medieval dating was a mix of elaborate social rituals, legal obligations, economic negotiations, and mild emotional terror. Gifts, letters, dances, and occasional awkward trials were all part of the slow, deliberate process of courtship. The emphasis was rarely on personal choice or passion. Instead, it was about alliances, property, and maintaining the family's reputation. Romance existed mostly on paper, in poetry, and occasionally in whispered moments between busy nobles trying not to sneeze in public. And with that, we'll pause for tonight's first exploration of medieval romantic customs. In the next segment, we'll drift into the slightly stranger waters of royal arranged marriages, where the stakes included kingdoms, genetic lineages, and sometimes very unhappy teenagers forced into eternal contracts. But for now, just breathe, settle in, and let the mild absurdities of medieval courtship wash over you like a warm and slightly awkward blanket. Part 2. Welcome back, everyone. If you're still cozy, maybe with a cup of tea or a soft blanket tucked around your shoulders, let's drift further into the peculiar world of medieval romance. Tonight, we're going to float over to the royal courts, where dating took on an entirely new flavor. Contracts, crowns, and occasional emotional disasters. Now, when it comes to royal marriages, personal choice was basically a joke. Kings, queens, and even teenage heirs were treated less like humans and more like chess pieces on a board that spanned countries. Love, if it existed, was usually incidental, which is to say it might emerge if you were lucky, or it might result in lifelong resentment if you weren't. These unions were political, strategic, and occasionally genetically adventurous. Let's start with the age factor. In many royal households, teenagers were considered marriage-ready long before modern standards would allow. We're talking 12, 13, sometimes 14 years old. This wasn't seen as weird, it was seen as efficient. A young princess could be married off to cement an alliance before she even had a proper understanding of hygiene, let alone love. Likewise, young princes might find themselves promised to a cousin across the continent with no say in the matter. Personal feelings? Optional. Physical maturity? Irrelevant. Ambition, reputation, and familial obedience? Mandatory. Now, take for example the Habsburgs, a family famous for their particular approach to marriage. By now, you may have heard the phrase, keeping it in the family. They really leaned into that. Cousins marrying cousins was the standard, not the exception. The goal was simple: preserve dynastic power, secure territories, and, if possible, avoid distributing the family wealth outside the bloodline. The result was a long line of royals who looked somewhat distinctive. In fact, historians have noted certain Habsburg facial traits that became more pronounced over generations, giving the impression of a family portrait filled with slightly awkward, sometimes potato-faced aristocrats. Charming, really. Of course, genetics aside, arranging these marriages was a logistical nightmare. Correspondence was slow, travel was even slower, and political landscapes could change mid-negotiation. A proposed marriage could take years to finalize. During this time, teenagers were often kept informed of their future spouse's appearance through portraits, sometimes flattering, sometimes less so. Imagine receiving a painting that promised tall, handsome, and majestic, only to meet someone who looked like a particularly solemn toddler. The disappointment was rarely acknowledged publicly. Royal decorum was everything. Once the marriage was arranged, the getting-to-know-you phase was often minimal. Some couples had barely met before being whisked into elaborate ceremonies and legal unions. They were expected to behave like mature adults, conduct themselves with dignity, and, at some point, produce heirs. Emotional preparedness was optional. Some royal teenagers approached this with stoic acceptance, others, not so much. Diaries and letters occasionally reveal expressions of dread, boredom, and minor rebellion, usually discreetly censored or destroyed by ambitious parents. The wedding ceremonies themselves were often as long as they were ceremonious. We're talking days, sometimes weeks of feasting, processions, and blessings, all meticulously recorded in court annals. The actual couple, however, often found these events exhausting and bewildering. One can imagine a young prince sighing quietly behind his velvet cloak while being paraded through throngs of cheering courtiers thinking, "I would rather be napping." Likewise, brides sometimes felt like walking, singing decorations. But of course, complaining was not permitted. Complaining in public could result in social disgrace, or worse, a severe lecture on the duties of royalty. And now the consummation of the marriage, a subject medieval chroniclers treated with careful euphemisms and sometimes unnecessary fascination. For young royals, this could be daunting. There was pressure from families, clergy, and the general expectation of producing heirs. For some, it led to awkward understandings, delayed attempts, and occasionally humorous, if mildly tragic, anecdotes in letters. Imagine being expected to perform one of the most significant duties of your life with someone you barely know and being carefully observed by an entire court of anxious onlookers. Comfortable, right? But let's not dwell solely on sexual awkwardness, as royal life was full of other peculiar quirks. Many young monarchs were given tutors, chaperones, and a bewildering array of rules about etiquette. One 13-year-old king might be instructed on swordplay in the morning, Latin in the afternoon, and proper sighing for courtly love in the evening. Meanwhile, a teenage queen could be tasked with learning embroidery, household management, and the subtle art of polite melancholy, all while preparing for her future role as the mother of heirs. Multitasking was not optional. It was mandatory. Royal marriages also came with emotional theatrics. Sibling rivalry, jealous courtiers, and ambitious mothers made the court a kind of slow-motion soap opera. Some young monarchs developed dramatic temperaments, sudden emotional meltdowns, or obsessive behaviors. These were frequently recorded with a polite, almost humorous detachment by chroniclers. For instance, a princess might throw herself on her bed, refuse to eat, and pen letters filled with despair, all while the court diplomatically pretended not to notice. Historical record-keeping was polite, if gently ironic. The princess was melancholy, as usual. Now, you might be wondering about the romantic potential in all this. Occasionally, love did blossom. There are cases of royal couples who developed genuine affection over time, sometimes decades later. But more often, marriages were tolerated, endured, or strategically navigated. Affection, if it existed, was often quiet, subtle, and private. Hardly the dramatic tales you might expect from historical romance novels. Young monarchs learned to compartmentalize feelings early. Love was rarely the point. Duty was. An interesting aside is the impact of personality clashes. Young monarchs met their future spouses at a time when temperament was still forming. Some were moody, some eccentric, and some downright strange by modern standards. When two strong personalities collided, court life could be a slow-motion disaster. Letters, diaries, and court reports sometimes reveal petty disputes, silent grudges, and passive-aggressive gestures that could last decades. Imagine an entire kingdom quietly suffering while the king and queen exchanged icy stares across banquet tables.
Romance, in these cases, was incidental at best. Let's not forget the broader political stakes. A teenage marriage wasn't just about two people. It was about alliances, treaties, and sometimes the survival of a dynasty. A poorly matched couple could lead to diplomatic complications, rebellions, or minor wars. So parents and advisors were deeply invested in compatibility, not emotionally, but strategically. A stubborn teenage princess refusing to smile at her husband could, in theory, destabilize international relations. And history tells us that, in subtle ways, it sometimes did. Dowries in royal marriages were naturally extravagant. Entire estates, jewels, and even entire towns could be promised as part of a union. This added layers of pressure and expectation. A princess might be praised for her beauty, intelligence, and lineage, but if her dowry was insufficient, she could face criticism from her new family. Wealth and politics were inseparable from romance, and young royals had to navigate this reality from the start of their lives. By now, you may be sensing a pattern. Medieval royal dating was slow, regulated, emotionally perilous, and, if you squint, a bit comical. The combination of political necessity, familial oversight, and adolescent awkwardness produced unions that were fascinating to historians, but often excruciating for the participants. And yet, despite all this, life continued. Monarchs grew up, heirs were produced, alliances were maintained, and the cycle repeated itself with the next generation. Some royal marriages stand out for their sheer absurdity. For instance, a young queen might find herself married to a man twice her age, chosen entirely for his ability to inherit land. Correspondence.
Part 3. Teen Monarchs and Their Quirks. Welcome back, friends. If you're still settled in, let's continue floating through the world of medieval royalty, specifically focusing on the awkward, strange, and occasionally tragic lives of teenage monarchs. Think of this as a slow tour through the very human side of history, the part that isn't in textbooks, but is whispered about in court annals and private letters. Teen monarchs were an unusual mix. Too young to have fully matured, yet expected to carry the weight of kingdoms on their shoulders. Their days were meticulously scheduled with lessons, prayers, ceremonies, and endless protocols. But because they were, after all, still children, or at least adolescents, they often developed habits and behaviors that ranged from mildly amusing to quietly concerning. Take, for instance, Edward VI of England. He became king at just 9 years old, which is already a lot to ask of any child. Historians describe him as intelligent and diligent, but like many young rulers, he was prone to emotional swings. Court life, with its endless rules and constant observation, could be exhausting. A young king's tantrums were not the kind you'd see in a playground, but carefully recorded in chronicles as melancholy or unsettled behavior. Essentially, these were polite ways of saying, he sometimes cried over trivial matters while a nation watched. Other monarchs had subtler quirks. Some were obsessive about cleanliness or order. Louis XIV, for example, took his personal hygiene seriously, insisting on elaborate bathing routines and precise arrangements of clothing and furniture. While this might seem mild today, at the time it required an army of attendants to maintain. A teen monarch like this would wake, have their hair powdered to perfection, and dictate minutiae about daily life with a seriousness that could be exhausting for everyone involved. Imagine being expected to wax the floors perfectly while the future of a country hangs on the balance. Food was another source of peculiar behavior. Young royals were often under constant supervision during meals. Some were extremely picky, others obsessed with ritual,
and a few developed eccentric preferences. Catherine de' Medici, as a teen queen, reportedly had a fascination with certain herbs and spices that she insisted be included in every meal. Meanwhile, others, like a certain young Habsburg, would occasionally refuse food entirely, citing vague notions of health or virtue, leaving courtiers scrambling in mild panic. Meals, of course, were also political. Sharing food or refusing it could send subtle messages to allies or enemies alike, so even appetite had consequences. Sleep habits, too, could be unusual. Some teen monarchs slept at strange hours, napped at inconvenient times, or insisted on elaborate bedtime rituals. A young king might require a specific order of attendance to perform minor tasks before he would even lie down. This might involve reading, prayers, or whispered instructions, all of which gave the court the quiet, ongoing impression that a kingdom was being run by a very particular child with exacting demands. Emotional meltdowns were, of course, part of the territory. Teenage rulers often faced pressures unimaginable to ordinary adolescents. Any minor frustration could lead to dramatic gestures, such as refusing to appear at court, crying in private, or, in rare cases, locking themselves in rooms for hours. Chroniclers, with their characteristic polite detachment, might describe this as, "The young monarch was unusually pensive," or "the king showed signs of inner conflict." In reality, it was probably a mix of stress, adolescence, and the unique absurdities of court life. Some teen monarchs developed eccentric interests that were simultaneously harmless and mildly alarming. For example, young rulers might collect bizarre objects, obsess over certain animals, or spend hours perfecting obscure skills. James I of Scotland, as a child, was reportedly fascinated by mechanical devices and would spend long hours observing them, often ignoring more pressing duties. Charles VI of France, though slightly older, developed obsessions with specific routines and clothing patterns, which, while historically significant, also hint at the pressures and anxieties of ruling at a young age. Education was another source of stress and eccentricity. Teen monarchs were expected to master multiple languages, understand complex law and diplomacy, and study theology, all while maintaining appearances. Tutors were strict, sometimes cruel, and relentless. A young prince might spend hours reciting Latin grammar, only to collapse in exhaustion and start scribbling poetry about ghosts or his own feelings of confinement. Some monarchs internalized these pressures, developing private journals filled with melancholy musings that revealed the emotional toll of early rulership. Friendships and social interactions were also odd. Young royals could only interact with peers under strict supervision. Playdates were rare. Socializing was a mix of strategic alliances and observation. Some monarchs formed intense bonds with a few select companions, who might serve as confidants or co-conspirators in small, harmless rebellions against the stifling routine of court life. Others, however, remained isolated, their only interactions dictated by ceremonial appearances and lessons. Emotional development in this context was uneven. Then there were the minor rituals that could seem utterly absurd today. Many teen monarchs had elaborate morning and evening routines. They might insist on the same attendants performing specific duties in a particular order, from washing to dressing to reading a brief prayer. Any deviation could provoke irritation or anxiety. Court officials had to learn to anticipate these routines with near military precision, lest they face the subtle but intense disapproval of a young ruler with a very particular temperament. Public appearances were another source of pressure. Teen monarchs were expected to smile, nod, and demonstrate grace and dignity in front of crowds. This was often difficult for adolescents, who might feel awkward or impatient. Chroniclers sometimes note that young rulers appeared sullen or pensive, which was a polite way of documenting teenage awkwardness under immense scrutiny. The public, of course, was rarely aware of the private anxieties behind these expressions. Illness and mental strain often intertwined with these quirks. Some teen monarchs were sickly, prone to fevers, or otherwise physically delicate. These conditions could exacerbate eccentricities or emotional swings. Others, even when healthy, developed obsessive habits or rituals as a means of coping with stress. We see examples of monarchs who insisted on specific clothing, food, or sleeping arrangements as a way of controlling the small parts of life they could manage amid the uncontrollable pressures of court life. Now a note on romance, or the lack thereof. Many teen monarchs were married off while still adolescents, as we discussed in the last segment. Love, as an independent, personal emotion, was rare at this stage. Some teen rulers developed deep attachments to their spouses over time. Others tolerated them as necessary partners in political theater. Diaries and letters sometimes hint at secret friendships or quiet emotional bonds. But in general, romance was secondary to the responsibilities and expectations imposed by family, state, and tradition. Despite all this, some teen monarchs were genuinely clever, adaptable, and resilient. They learned to navigate a court filled with intrigue, political maneuvering, and eccentric adults who were just as odd as they were. They mastered diplomacy, ceremonial duties, and sometimes, surprisingly, military strategy. But even these accomplishments often came with personal costs: social isolation, pressure, and emotional strain that would shape their personalities for the rest of their lives. So, as you settle a little deeper into your chair or pillow, consider the human side of history. Adolescents forced into monumental responsibility, learning to manage kingdoms, emotions, and eccentricities simultaneously. They were children, but also monarchs. They were awkward, but expected to be perfect. And they remind us that behind every crown, there is a person trying to navigate life one small, weird, and slightly tragic step at a time. And with that, we'll pause tonight's meditation on
Part 4. Teenage Monarchs and Their Odd Habits. Welcome back. If you're still curled up, maybe with a soft pillow behind your head, let's drift further into the world of teenage monarchs, this time looking at some very specific individuals. They may have ruled kingdoms, but they were still teenagers, and as such, their lives were filled with quirks, awkward moments, and occasional emotional turbulence. Let's start with Edward VI of England, who we briefly mentioned before. Edward became king at 9, which is basically like being handed a complicated board game with no instructions, and then being expected to win. He was intelligent and diligent, probably more mature than many adults around him, but also very young. Chroniclers note that he often suffered from melancholic moods, sometimes withdrawing for hours into private study or quiet reflection. This might sound impressive, but for a child of 9, ruling a kingdom was a lot to ask. Edward reportedly had a habit of working late into the night, reading law and theology, which might explain why he occasionally appeared pale, withdrawn, or generally overwhelmed during public appearances. Meanwhile, over in France, Charles VI, who became king at 11, had a different set of quirks.
He's famous for bouts of mental instability, sometimes called madness in historical records. While today we might speculate about medical conditions or psychological stress, at the time his episodes were noted with polite detachment. One moment he could be calm and kingly, the next he might refuse to eat, speak incoherently, or wander the halls muttering. His courtiers had to develop a kind of gentle choreography. When he was stable, maintain decorum. When he was not, avoid confrontation, and generally hope he didn't decide to reorganize the furniture violently. Childhood anxiety plus kingdom-sized responsibilities equals one very unusual adolescence. Now, consider Louis XIV of France, who became king at 4, though realistically, his reign didn't truly begin until he was older. Even as a young boy, Louis was acutely aware of observation. Every gesture, every expression was noted and recorded. Some historians suggest that this constant surveillance influenced his later obsession with control, ceremony, and order. As a teen, he reportedly had elaborate routines, insisting on precise arrangements of his belongings, clothing, and even daily schedules. It may seem charmingly fastidious today, but it meant courtiers had to be acutely attentive or risk displeasing the king. Let's float over to Mary, Queen of Scots, who became queen as an infant, but was educated and prepared for rulership as a teenager. Mary was highly intelligent, fluent in several languages, and politically aware, but her teen years were filled with emotional strain. She was expected to navigate the treacherous waters of court alliances, religious tensions, and marriage negotiations. Letters from her adolescence reveal a young woman struggling with isolation, pressure, and the realization that personal desires were often secondary to dynastic necessity. She reportedly had periods of intense melancholy, which were recorded politely by advisors as a reflective disposition. Translation: she was a teenager, quietly stressed, and not thrilled about being queen. Moving north, James I of Scotland, who became king at just 13 months old, though obviously he didn't rule as a toddler, had an upbringing that encouraged curiosity and eccentricity. As a teen, he developed an intense fascination with mechanical devices, horology, and scholarly pursuits. His obsessions were harmless, though they sometimes led to tension with advisors who preferred more conventional interests like military strategy or diplomacy. James's curiosity reflects a recurring pattern. Teen monarchs often pursued intense, singular interests as a way of exercising control in a life where most decisions were made for them. Another interesting case is Ferdinand II of Aragon, who, as a teenager, was extremely serious and ambitious. He became king at a young age through dynastic marriage arrangements and quickly learned the pressures of rulership. Letters suggest he was intensely disciplined with strict routines for reading, prayer, and governance. At times, this seriousness tipped into minor eccentricities. Ferdinand reportedly had fixed times for meals and prayer, sometimes refusing to deviate, which could frustrate advisors accustomed to more flexible schedules. Now, quirks weren't always about intellect or discipline. Some were emotional, even theatrical. For example, Isabella of Castile, as a teenager, reportedly experienced moments of dramatic gloom. She might withdraw from court activities, pen melancholy letters, or insist on periods of solitude. In modern terms, she was experiencing normal teenage mood swings, but magnified by the responsibilities of leadership and expectations of royalty. Courtiers had to learn subtle strategies, provide comfort without undermining authority, observe carefully without seeming intrusive. It was a delicate balance. Teen monarchs also often developed peculiar habits with clothing and personal appearance. Charles VI, for instance, was reportedly obsessed with the arrangement of his garments. Louis XIV had highly regimented dressing rituals. A teen monarch might insist on wearing certain fabrics, colors, or combinations, and deviations were considered minor offenses. These habits might seem trivial, but they reflect the need for predictability and control in lives otherwise dominated by external expectations. Even seemingly small rituals like grooming, bedtime routines, or dining habits could take on outsized importance. Young monarchs often demanded precise sequences of attendance, performing specific tasks in order. A missing brush or incorrectly folded garment could trigger irritation or anxiety. These behaviors, recorded with mild amusement by chroniclers, offer us an insight into the emotional lives of teenagers managing immense responsibility. They are a mix of coping mechanism, eccentricity, and a natural desire for structure in chaotic surroundings. Emotional meltdowns were another recurring theme. Teen monarchs often faced periods of intense stress or sadness. Edward VI reportedly had moments of quiet withdrawal, sitting for hours reading or reflecting alone. Charles VI had more extreme episodes, sometimes wandering halls in disoriented states. Mary, Queen of Scots, experienced melancholy and occasional bouts of anxiety. Isabella of Castile had reflective periods of withdrawal. All of this, of course, was recorded in court annals with polite understatement. The king or queen was unusually pensive. Translation: teenage stress, elevated to a national stage. Social interactions were equally constrained. Teen monarchs could only meet peers under strict supervision, limiting friendship development. Some formed deep private bonds with selected companions or tutors. Others remained isolated, their only social interactions dictated by ceremonial duties or lessons. Emotional development in this context was uneven. Some monarchs grew resilient and clever, while others developed quirks or obsessions that persisted into adulthood. Dietary habits could be eccentric as well. Some young rulers were picky, insisting on specific foods or rejecting meals entirely. Others developed obsessive preferences for herbs, spices, or textures. Food was not just nourishment, but a subtle signal of control. A royal teen could use mealtime preferences to exert influence over attendance, express discontent, or assert autonomy in an environment otherwise dominated by external authority. Sleep routines, too, were often peculiar. Some monarchs slept at odd hours, demanded specific rituals, or required attendants to perform tasks before bed. These habits allowed a small measure of control over an otherwise highly regulated existence. Courtiers and servants had to memorize these routines, often performing minor ceremonies for bedtime preparation. The slightest deviation could provoke irritation or anxiety. In short, teenage monarchs were fascinatingly complex. They were expected to act as adults before they fully understood the world around them. They developed eccentric habits, peculiar obsessions, and emotional responses that reflected both their age and the immense pressures of rulership. These behaviors, recorded politely by chroniclers, offer us a glimpse into the very human side of medieval monarchy. As we drift toward the end of this segment, it's worth noting that
Part 5. When teen monarchs meet arranged marriages. Welcome back, friends. If you're still settling in, perhaps with a soft blanket and a quiet cup of tea, let's drift gently into a particularly peculiar corner of history, the intersection of teenage monarchs, arranged marriages, and the occasional mild disaster. We've already touched on how teen monarchs were eccentric, moody, and slightly overwhelmed. We've also discussed how arranged marriages were politically strategic, often ignoring personal preference entirely. Put these two elements together, and you have a recipe for subtly tragic, occasionally amusing, and always awkward royal stories. Take, for example, Mary, Queen of Scots, again. As a teenager, she was married off to the French Dauphin, Francis II. Imagine being 14, sent to a foreign court where everyone speaks a slightly different language, and then expected to act like a mature queen. Letters from the time hint at her isolation and anxiety. She was expected to adapt instantly to French court customs, participate in complex ceremonies, and perform the role of devoted wife, without much guidance from anyone who genuinely understood her age or emotional needs. The marriage was politically sound, but personally it was an enormous strain. Meanwhile, back in England, Edward VI observed the careful maneuverings of marriages and alliances, albeit from his perch of adolescent melancholy. He understood on some level that marriage could be both a political tool and a source of social pressure. Even if he wasn't yet personally negotiating unions, the expectations were clear. When he grew older, his choice, or lack thereof, would be dictated by diplomacy, family strategy, and the occasional bout of royal absurdity. One recurring theme in these teen royal unions was misaligned personalities. Young rulers, thrust together for political convenience, often found themselves incompatible. For instance, a vibrant, imaginative princess might be married to a reserved, rigid prince. They had to coexist, maintain appearances, and occasionally produce heirs, all while still figuring out who they were as individuals. Letters and diaries often hint at quiet dissatisfaction, occasional frustration, and subtle attempts to assert independence within these arrangements. We also see examples of odd, almost comical misunderstandings. Teen monarchs were, after all, children in highly adult situations. Some misinterpreted gestures, letters, or courtly advice, leading to minor social mishaps. For instance, a young queen might misread a subtle political hint and respond with what seemed like dramatic defiance, only to be gently corrected by her advisors. These moments, while historically minor, give us a fascinating glimpse into the intersection of adolescence, responsibility, and ceremonial expectation. Eccentric habits often collided in these marriages. Louis XIV, for example, married Marie Thérèse of Spain as a teenager. She naturally brought her own habits, rituals, and expectations. Louis, obsessed with ceremony and daily routines, may have found certain elements of her behaviors slightly challenging. Courtiers were tasked with managing these overlapping eccentricities while ensuring that the marriage appeared perfectly harmonious in public. Minor conflicts were inevitable, but public decorum required that everyone appear calm, smiling, and refined. Some marriages were also complicated by geographic and cultural distance. Young monarchs often moved to foreign courts for political unions, leaving behind familiar surroundings, friends, and family. The isolation could intensify eccentric behavior, melancholy, and emotional swings. Teen monarchs had to adapt quickly, learning foreign languages, customs, and etiquette, all while performing the duties of royalty. Letters from these periods often reveal quiet desperation, subtle humor, and occasional clever observations about the absurdities of court life. And then there were the quirky rituals surrounding intimacy and heir production. In some cases, teen monarchs were barely physically mature, yet expected to fulfill adult marital duties.
Chronicles describe awkward delays, hesitations, and minor misunderstandings, often recorded with the polite detachment of historians more amused than alarmed. These private struggles were layered on top of public obligations, adding a subtle tension to everyday life. Sibling relationships sometimes added another dimension. Teen monarchs often had brothers or sisters who were similarly constrained by protocol. Rivalries, minor jealousies, and attempts at asserting dominance or independence were common. Letters occasionally hint at subtle sabotage, mild pranks, or quiet competition for attention, privileges, or even affection from parents. These small dramas played out alongside political responsibilities, creating a layered, ongoing social dynamic within the court. Another recurring theme was misaligned expectations about behavior. A teenage queen might be expected to appear cheerful and gracious, even while feeling homesick or anxious. A teenage king might be expected to display authority and wisdom, even while struggling with adolescent insecurity or fatigue. Courtiers had to learn to interpret subtle cues, provide support discreetly, and manage appearances, all without provoking embarrassment or emotional outbursts from their young sovereigns. Then there are the cases of cultural or religious conflicts within marriages. Teen monarchs often married across borders, bringing together families with different traditions, religious expectations, and courtly customs. Minor misunderstandings could escalate into awkward social faux pas or polite indignation. A princess might insist on certain rituals, a prince on others, and the court had to choreograph an elaborate dance of diplomacy and subtle compliance. Teenagers, as we know, are prone to strong opinions. So imagine this dynamic multiplied by dynastic stakes and public scrutiny. Despite all this pressure, some teen marriages did eventually develop into genuine affection. Slowly, over years, young monarchs might grow accustomed to each other, find shared interests, and develop emotional bonds. But even then, eccentricities persisted. Childhood habits, anxieties, and quirks often remained long after formal adolescence ended. A king might still obsess over daily routines. A queen might maintain certain private rituals, and the court would continue to navigate these idiosyncrasies with quiet patience. In short, teen monarchs combined with arranged marriages produced a peculiar blend of awkwardness, mild tragedy, and subtle comedy. Political necessity often outweighed personal preference. Emotional development was constrained, and eccentric habits were amplified by constant surveillance. Yet these young rulers adapted in fascinating ways, creating patterns of behavior and coping mechanisms that offer insight into the human side of medieval monarchy. So, as you sink a little deeper into your chair or pillow, consider this. Behind every crown was a teenager figuring out life under impossible circumstances, managing moods, routines, and relationships, all while maintaining the outward appearance of regal composure. Their stories remind us that even in the grand halls of palaces, human nature, awkward, anxious, and occasionally absurd, remains constant across centuries. And with that, we'll pause tonight's exploration of teen monarchs and arranged marriages. In the next part, we'll drift further into dynastic inbreeding, hereditary quirks, and the subtle consequences of keeping it all in the family, continuing our slow, mildly amusing journey through royal history.
Part 6. Dynastic Inbreeding and Royal Quirks. Welcome back, friends. If you're still nestled in with blankets or a warm drink, let's slowly float into a particularly peculiar corner of history, the world of dynastic inbreeding.
This is where politics, family loyalty, and questionable decision-making collided, leaving a trail of mildly tragic, sometimes absurd outcomes in European royalty. In medieval Europe, royal families were obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure. By pure, they mostly meant concentrated within the family, ideally avoiding outsiders who might dilute power, property, or influence. Cousins married cousins, aunts married nephews, uncles married nieces. The family tree became less like a tree and more like a knotted vine, twisting back on itself in ways that would make any modern geneticist shudder. One of the most famous examples is the Habsburg dynasty, whose obsession with intermarriage produced some strikingly recognizable features. You may have seen the term Habsburg jaw or Habsburg lip in textbooks. It's not a myth. Repeated cousin marriages resulted in pronounced mandibular prognathism, a slightly elongated lower jaw, making several Habsburg monarchs look, well, let's say distinctively aristocratic. Charming in a historically awkward sort of way. Inbreeding also brought other hereditary quirks. Some Habsburg kings and queens suffered from dental issues, joint problems, and even difficulties with speech. Charles II of Spain, for instance, was famously affected by generations of inbreeding. He had physical deformities, developmental delays, and health problems so severe that he was unable to produce an heir, ironically ending the very dynastic continuity his ancestors sought to preserve. It's a gentle historical lesson. Sometimes keeping it in the family has unexpected consequences. The consequences of inbreeding weren't limited to physical appearance. Emotional and behavioral quirks were sometimes amplified. Court records describe certain monarchs as melancholic, irritable, or prone to sudden mood swings. It's tempting to chalk this entirely up to personality, but genetic factors likely played a subtle role, amplified by the intense pressures of rulership from a young age. Imagine being both genetically predisposed to quirks and socially required to appear perfect. No wonder so many royals developed eccentric habits. Marriage practices were central to this. Parents often prioritized dynastic advantage over personal compatibility. A princess might be married to a second cousin she barely knew, her life carefully orchestrated to maintain the family line. Teen monarchs, as we've seen, were already struggling with personal development. Layering genetic consolidation on top of political pressure, strict routines, and early marriage created a potent mix of awkwardness, anxiety, and occasionally tragic outcomes. A recurring theme is that inbreeding sometimes enhanced minor quirks into notable eccentricities. A mild speech impediment could become pronounced. A slight developmental delay could impact decision-making. Even minor physical anomalies were recorded in chronicles with polite detachment, as though noting a minor inconvenience in an otherwise busy royal schedule. Chroniclers described, for instance, small Habsburg princes as handsome but oddly proportioned, or intelligent yet delicate. Translation: perfectly polite ways of saying that genetics and courtly pressure were not always kind. It wasn't limited to the Habsburgs, of course. The Bourbons, Valois, and other European dynasties also practiced consanguineous marriage to varying degrees. The principle was simple: consolidate power, preserve property, and maintain alliances. The outcome was often predictable. Physical or developmental quirks, sometimes combined with heightened eccentricity. Teen monarchs entering these unions were already emotionally and socially vulnerable, so the combination could be awkward, stressful, and occasionally tragic. Interestingly, dynastic inbreeding also affected courtly life in subtle ways. Courtiers had to accommodate monarchs with unusual habits or health issues. An awkward posture, a sensitive jaw, or a peculiar nervous tic could dictate furniture arrangement, seating order, or even the timing of meals.
The kingdom was run in part around the idiosyncrasies of genetically consolidated rulers. It's history's slow-motion absurdity, dynasties literally adapting daily life to accommodate the quirks they helped produce. They're charming examples of minor eccentricities magnified by inbreeding. Charles II of Spain, for example, reportedly had trouble walking, speaking, and chewing, which required constant assistance from attendants. Yet he was king, expected to perform public appearances and fulfill ceremonial duties. Imagine a room full of courtiers teetoing around, ensuring the king's comfort, while political alliances hung on the balance. It's awkward, tragic, and yet, in a slow, gently ironic way, fascinating. Then there's the emotional side. Teen monarchs with inherited quirks often faced subtle social isolation. Even within the palace, their differences could separate them from peers, tutors, or potential companions. They learned early to navigate complex social hierarchies while coping with personal limitations. Emotional resilience was necessary, but eccentricity was inevitable. Some developed obsessive routines, intense intellectual pursuits, or peculiar habits simply to cope. In some cases, these quirks influenced marriage negotiations. Advisors and parents were aware that certain traits might persist or worsen. Arranged marriages were sometimes chosen with both political advantage and genetic considerations in mind, though mostly the latter was more about avoiding outsiders than avoiding hereditary problems. The irony, of course, is that attempts to preserve family traits sometimes magnified the very quirks they sought to control. Teen monarchs thrust into these unions had little say, but bore the consequences of centuries of dynastic planning. Interestingly, chroniclers occasionally noted subtle humor in these arrangements. Descriptions of a slightly awkward prince marrying a similarly peculiar cousin often included faintly amused observations. Courtiers learned to record quirks politely, noting eccentric behaviors without dramatizing them. A minor tic became a habit of idleness. A slightly odd appearance became distinctive, and a nervous speech pattern became softly particular. Historical irony, in other words, draped gently over human imperfection. It's also worth noting that dynastic inbreeding didn't just affect physical or mental traits. It shaped courtly expectations and etiquette. Young monarchs with quirks needed specialized attendants, modified routines, or even adjusted ceremonial protocols. A simple meal could require adaptations. A minor task could involve multiple intermediaries. Life itself was subtly reorganized around inherited eccentricities. This may explain why so many teen monarchs developed obsessive attention to detail, peculiar habits, or unusual routines. They were learning, consciously or unconsciously, to manage a life tailored to their inherited traits. Finally, consider the long-term effects. Teen monarchs who survived these pressures often grew into adults with pronounced personalities, shaped by both genetics and upbringing. Some became rigid, meticulous rulers. Others became melancholic, eccentric, or oddly obsessive. Yet all of them reflect a fascinating intersection of human biology, family ambition, and the slow, deliberate machinery of monarchy. Their quirks, inherited and amplified, offer historians a quiet, endlessly absorbing glimpse into the human side of dynastic ambition. So, as we pause tonight's exploration of dynastic inbreeding, let yourself reflect on the strange, mildly tragic, and often quietly humorous consequences of centuries of keeping it in the family. Teen monarchs inherited more than crowns. They inherited the subtle, sometimes awkward legacies of their ancestors' marital choices, combined with the intense pressures of early rule. The result is a pattern that is fascinating, gently absurd, and quietly human.
In the next part, we'll explore the personal habits, small rebellions, and private eccentricities of royal children, drifting further into the strangely charming world of medieval monarchy. For now, just breathe. Let the slow cadence of history wash over you, and picture the oddly distinct faces, peculiar habits, and quietly dramatic routines of Europe's most inbred, heavily supervised, and mildly tragic teen monarchs.
Part 7. Royal Children, Private Eccentricities, and Tiny Rebellions. Welcome back. If you are still comfortably settled, perhaps with a blanket tucked around your shoulders and the lights dimmed, let's drift gently into the quieter, more intimate world of royal children. These are the princes and princesses who weren't quite rulers yet, but were already living lives filled with rules, rituals, and subtle pressures. Lives that, in many ways, were as peculiar as the crowns they were destined to inherit. From a young age, royal children were expected to learn not just reading and arithmetic, but the intricate art of ceremonial behavior, strategic thinking, and polite restraint. Their lives were highly structured, yet even within these constraints, eccentricities emerged. Private habits, personal quirks, and tiny rebellions became a natural part of childhood under constant observation. Consider young Edward VI again, before he formally assumed kingship. He had moments of quiet withdrawal, sitting alone for hours with books or letters. These solitary periods might be seen as early signs of diligence, or perhaps simply the coping mechanisms of a child learning to navigate an overwhelming world. Similarly, letters from tutors and courtiers occasionally note minor emotional outbursts, tantrums, sulks, and quiet complaints about excessive study. Polite phrasing in chronicles often masked the reality. Children were, after all, still children, even if destined for crowns. Food was another area where eccentricities appeared. Royal children could be picky or obsessive, preferring certain dishes, insisting on specific textures, or refusing meals entirely. Catherine de' Medici, as a young girl, reportedly had a fascination with herbs and spices, sometimes rejecting standard fare in favor of her preferred flavors. Such habits weren't merely personal, they also sent subtle messages to the household about control, autonomy, and preference within highly structured lives. A young princess might declare that only a certain dish was acceptable, and courtiers would scramble to accommodate lest they provoke minor displeasure. Sleep routines were equally regimented, yet full of quirks. Some royal children demanded particular attendants perform nightly tasks in a precise order. Others required extended reading or ritual before resting. These habits may seem trivial, but in a household filled with ceremonial expectation, they were essential. Attendants learned to anticipate whims, adjust routines, and perform minor chores in exact sequences. Even small deviations could provoke irritation or silent protest from young royals. Private eccentricities also emerged in playtime. Royal children, despite rigid schedules, often found ways to explore curiosity or amusement. Some collected insects, feathers, or odd objects, treating them as treasures. Others became fascinated with mechanical devices, clocks, or miniature replicas of courtly life. These hobbies may seem quaint today, but they were often the only outlets for creativity and autonomy in otherwise highly controlled environments. Letters and diaries occasionally reveal subtle acts of rebellion. A princess might hide letters from friends or tutors, or sneak away from lessons to explore a garden. A prince might refuse to participate in ceremonial practice, hide from attendance, or engage in minor mischief. These tiny rebellions were rarely dramatic, but offered a quiet assertion of individuality in lives dominated by expectation.
Courtiers often recorded them with polite amusement, noting the young prince exhibited uncharacteristic independence, which translates roughly to he was being a normal, slightly naughty child under extremely odd circumstances. Education, as always, was central to royal upbringing, yet it often produced eccentric habits. Tutors reported children developing obsessive focus on particular subjects, reciting Latin or theology for hours, or inventing elaborate games around moral lessons. This intensity might be interpreted as diligence, or in modern terms, a charming kind of obsessive behavior. These habits, while harmless, shaped the mental landscapes of young monarchs, instilling both knowledge and a subtle eccentricity that would carry into adolescence and adulthood. Social interactions were another arena for minor quirks. Royal children were generally isolated from peers, interacting primarily with attendants, tutors, or similarly young relatives. Friendships were highly structured and supervised. Some children formed intense, almost exclusive bonds with a single companion, while others remained more solitary. Emotional development in these circumstances was both constrained and intensified. Attachments were deep, but social flexibility was limited. This contributed to the development of focused interests, strong preferences, and sometimes peculiar emotional habits. Religion also played a role in shaping quirks. Daily prayers, fasting, and ritual observance were integral parts of childhood. Some royal children embraced these routines with intensity, exhibiting devotion that might seem extreme to modern observers. Others resisted subtly, finding small ways to circumvent rules or perform rituals in idiosyncratic ways. Again, these behaviors weren't dramatic defiance. They were minor, private expressions of autonomy in a highly regimented life. Let us not forget minor obsessions with appearance. Even as children, young royals were conscious of presentation. They might become fixated on clothing, grooming, or posture, mirroring adult courtly expectations. Some developed obsessive routines for dressing or arranging hair, while others were intensely concerned with personal hygiene or etiquette. These habits were often the precursors to adult eccentricities we've already discussed. They were in essence the first layer of learned perfectionism under observation. Playtime, when allowed, could also reveal character. Some royal children treated games as serious training in diplomacy, strategy, or ceremonial decorum. Others engaged in playful subversion, deliberately breaking minor rules to test boundaries. Courtiers and tutors had to walk a fine line, encouraging learning and obedience while tolerating small acts of individuality. Diaries sometimes hint at amusement or frustration over these moments, describing them with gentle irony. The young prince entertained himself with unexpected ingenuity during recess. Translation: he was probably hiding from his tutor while plotting minor chaos. Even minor health quirks were amplified in royal households. A child prone to illness, delicate constitution, or mild physical anomaly required special care. This often dictated daily routines, seating arrangements, and interactions with peers. Attendants learned to adjust expectations and perform subtle caregiving tasks without disrupting ceremonial appearance. In this sense, eccentricities, health, and courtly protocol were deeply intertwined. In short, royal children were fascinatingly complex. They were expected to learn, obey, and eventually rule, all while managing the quiet anxieties and emotional fluctuations of childhood. Tiny rebellions, eccentric habits, obsessive routines, and peculiar obsessions were natural responses to highly structured lives. They provide historians with intimate glimpses into the human side of monarchy, curiosity, frustration, cleverness, and the subtle assertion of individuality under intense supervision. As we gently close this segment, consider this. Even before ascending thrones, royal children navigated a world filled with expectations, rituals, and obligations far beyond their years. Their small acts of rebellion, private quirks, and eccentricities were in many ways quietly heroic. They remind us that even in palaces, the experience of childhood, awkward, constrained, sometimes frustrating, is universal, albeit amplified by crowns and crowns to be. And with that, we'll pause tonight's reflection on royal childhoods. In the next part, we'll explore the intersection of royal eccentricity and personal tragedy, focusing on teen monarchs whose quirks, health struggles, and emotional pressures created quietly melancholy lives. For now, let yourself sink further into the rhythm of history, the slow, oddly comforting cadence of palace life, eccentric children, and tiny rebellions that echo through time.
Part 8. Teen Monarchs and Quiet Tragedy. Welcome back. If you're still nestled comfortably, perhaps with a pillow tucked under your head and the room dim, let's float gently into a quieter, more melancholic corner of history, the personal tragedies and emotional pressures of teen monarchs. Here, there are no duels or battles, no dramatic intrigue, just the slow, almost hypnotic weight of expectation, responsibility, and human vulnerability. Being a teen monarch was a strange combination of privilege and isolation. These young rulers had vast power in theory, but their daily lives were tightly controlled. Advisors, tutors, attendants, and relatives often dictated their schedules, decisions, and even minor habits. They were never truly free, yet expected to carry the symbolic weight of kingdoms. This imbalance between appearance and reality often created subtle tragedy. Consider Edward VI once more. As a young king, he was intellectually precocious and deeply conscientious, but the chroniclers note periods of quiet melancholy. He spent hours reading law, theology, and political treatises, tasks that would challenge adults, let alone a young teenager. Beyond intellectual fatigue, Edward carried the unspoken anxiety of succession, religious division in England, and political maneuvering. It's no surprise that his letters and reports sometimes reveal moments of introspective sadness or withdrawal. He was a child bearing an adult-sized burden. Similarly, Charles VI of France, who became king at 11, faced both political and personal pressures that weighed heavily on him. His episodes of mental instability, sometimes described as madness, were punctuated by long stretches of melancholy or withdrawal. The young monarch's condition was exacerbated by isolation, intense scrutiny, and the constant expectation to perform perfectly in public. Even when he appeared calm, he carried private anxieties, emotional fragility, and a keen awareness of the stakes of every action. Emotional strain was compounded by family dynamics. Teen monarchs often had parents, siblings, or extended relatives heavily involved in political strategy. Advisors dictated marriage choices, ceremonial behavior, and even social friendships. A young ruler might comply outwardly, while experiencing private resentment, anxiety, or sadness. Diaries and letters occasionally hint at these hidden pressures. They reveal teenagers attempting to negotiate between personal desire and dynastic obligation, a negotiation often fraught with subtle tragedy.
Health issues also contributed to melancholy. Many teen monarchs were sickly, delicate, or prone to chronic ailments. Charles II of Spain, while slightly older than a teenager when he ascended, had lifelong health challenges that began in adolescence. Edward VI suffered from recurring fevers that weakened him physically and emotionally. A frail body compounded emotional pressure, creating a quiet, persistent sense of vulnerability. The crown was heavy enough without the added weight of illness. Loneliness was another subtle tragedy. Teen monarchs were frequently isolated from peers, with social interactions limited to tutors, attendants, and occasionally other young royals. This isolation could intensify melancholy, foster anxiety, or encourage private eccentricities. Some teens became obsessive about small routines, personal rituals, or specific hobbies, simply as a way of coping with solitude. These habits, charming or peculiar in hindsight, were also survival strategies for young rulers navigating a world both vast and constricted. Arranged marriages added another layer of complexity. Teen monarchs, expected to marry for political alliance, sometimes found themselves emotionally unprepared for intimacy, companionship, or cohabitation. Letters from these periods hint at quiet dissatisfaction, longing, or mild frustration. Courtiers often interpreted these expressions diplomatically, masking subtle personal grief in polite euphemism. Her Majesty displayed reflective thoughtfulness, which likely translates to, "She is quietly miserable but socially impeccable." The pressures of public appearance contributed as well. Young monarchs were observed constantly during ceremonies, meals, walks, and prayers. Every expression, gesture, or hesitation was noted by courtiers, chroniclers, and eventually historians. The need to maintain composure while managing adolescent insecurity created a quiet tension that could manifest as melancholy, withdrawal, or obsessive routines. Teen monarchs learned early to present perfection outwardly while navigating private uncertainty. Some teen monarchs developed subtle coping mechanisms. Obsessive reading, meticulous attention to schedules, or intense focus on hobbies provided a structured outlet for anxiety. Letters and diaries reveal moments of private humor, quiet reflection, or mild mischief. Small ways to assert autonomy within the confines of a highly supervised life. These behaviors were adaptive, yet also underscored the underlying pressure. Life was rigid, expectations were high, and personal freedom was limited. It's also notable how small failures could exacerbate emotional strain. A missed gesture in public, a minor dispute with an advisor, or a subtle social misstep could provoke private anxiety or sadness. Teen monarchs were expected to learn from these mistakes with minimal support, a process that often intensified melancholy. Even seemingly trivial events took on amplified significance under the constant scrutiny of court life. Letters from teen monarchs occasionally hint at longing for normalcy. Some wished for simple companionship, quiet walks, or moments without ceremony. Others expressed curiosity about life outside palace walls. These glimpses are striking because they reveal the universal nature of adolescence, desire for autonomy, emotional complexity, and curiosity about the wider world. The tragedy is subtle but palpable. All of these natural inclinations were constrained by rank, protocol, and the ever-watchful eyes of court observers. Even minor health issues contributed to emotional pressure. Illness could prevent participation in social activities, limit educational progress, or delay ceremonial duties. Chroniclers often described these limitations with polite detachment, but they likely intensified private sadness or frustration. The interplay of physical vulnerability and social expectation created a quiet, continuous tension in teen monarchs' daily lives. And then there is grief. Teen monarchs frequently experienced loss. Siblings, parents, or advisors died unexpectedly. Mourning was not just personal, it was ceremonial, public, and prolonged. Teenagers were expected to perform grief with decorum, adhere to ritual, and maintain appearances while processing genuine loss. The juxtaposition of private emotion and public expectation created a uniquely melancholic environment, quietly shaping personality and future behavior. It's important to note that these pressures did not always produce overt despair. Many teen monarchs demonstrated remarkable resilience. They found subtle ways to express emotion, navigate relationships, and maintain dignity. Yet even their clever coping strategies underscore the quiet, persistent weight of responsibility. Melancholy, eccentricity, and minor obsessions were not signs of weakness. They were natural adaptations to a life both extraordinary and constricted. In summary, teen monarchs lived lives of quiet contradiction. Immense power coupled with limited freedom. Constant observation paired with personal isolation. Ceremonial expectation alongside private emotional turbulence. Their melancholy was not dramatic. It was gentle, persistent, and human. Chroniclers recorded it politely. Historians interpret it thoughtfully, and today we can imagine the subtle texture of adolescent stress played out against the backdrop of palace walls, ceremonial.
Part 9. Adult Monarchs and Lingering Eccentricities. Welcome back. If you're still comfortably settled, perhaps with a warm drink and dimmed lights, let's drift gently into the lives of adult monarchs, focusing on the subtle eccentricities that lingered from their teenage years. Even when they reached the throne, the habits, anxieties, and routines developed in adolescence often remained, quietly shaping behavior, court life, and public perception. One striking example is Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. By the time he was a teenager, Louis had already developed a rigid daily schedule, meticulous attention to clothing, and a fascination with ceremony. These habits did not vanish once he became king. Instead, they were magnified. His obsession with routine and precise ceremonial order became legendary. Courtiers learned to anticipate every gesture, meal, and wardrobe adjustment. What began as adolescent coping mechanisms, structured schedules, obsessive attention to detail, had matured into a full-fledged system of governance built around personal preference. Similarly, Charles VI of France, whose teenage years were marked by melancholy and mental instability, carried many of these traits into adulthood. His episodic mental health struggles persisted, but they were often accompanied by carefully managed eccentricities designed to maintain appearances. Even adult routines, furniture arrangements, and ceremonial protocols were subtly adapted to accommodate lingering anxieties and compulsions. Teen habits, refined by courtly expectation, became long-term behaviors influencing both public image and governance. Edward VI of England, had he survived longer, might have displayed a similar continuity of teenage eccentricity into adulthood. While he died young, his adolescence was characterized by obsessive study, strict routines, and intense self-discipline. These traits, if extended, would likely have shaped his adult reign in similarly structured ways, illustrating a recurring pattern. Adolescent coping mechanisms often become adult eccentricities when power amplifies their impact. Arranged marriages contributed as well. Many adult monarchs continued to maintain rituals, preferences, and obsessions first established during teenage courtships.
A queen married young might insist on precise routines for meals, sleeping, or correspondence, echoing habits developed during formative years. A king accustomed to observing strict ceremonial order as a teen might carry these obsessions into adult governance, creating courts that revolved around personal eccentricity as much as political necessity. Eccentricity often manifested in personal appearance and grooming habits. Adult monarchs who developed adolescent concerns about posture, clothing, or hygiene tended to maintain and exaggerate these habits. Some became famously meticulous about their wardrobes, insisting on exact arrangements of garments, colors, or even shoe ties. Others maintained obsessive grooming routines or required attendants to perform precise tasks multiple times per day. What began as adolescent coping or experimentation became ritualized behavior, quietly dominating daily life. Dietary habits persisted as well. Monarchs who were picky as teens often remained so into adulthood, sometimes with added ceremonial significance. Meals could become carefully staged performances, with attendants following precise instructions to satisfy both personal taste and ritualistic expectation. These seemingly minor preferences often shaped the functioning of entire households, subtly structuring court life around what began as adolescent quirks. Even seemingly trivial obsessions could have larger consequences. Consider monarchs who developed intense intellectual pursuits or hobbies as teenagers, collecting books, studying languages, or engaging with mechanical devices. These interests, initially personal and private, could influence adult governance, patronage, or diplomacy. Obsessive attention to detail in childhood often matured into equally obsessive control over courtly and political matters. What might have been charming adolescent quirks evolved into defining characteristics of reign. Personality and emotional habits were another area of continuity. Teen monarchs who experienced melancholy, anxiety, or minor mood swings often carried these tendencies into adulthood. Some adapted by developing highly structured routines or ritualized behaviors. Others allowed quirks to manifest as private eccentricities, occasionally visible to observers. Letters and diaries frequently hint at subtle humor, quiet reflection, or mild irritability, behaviors rooted in adolescent coping strategies but sustained across a lifetime. Courtly relations were also shaped by lingering teenage eccentricities. Monarchs accustomed to private companionship, structured friendships, or selective social interaction as adolescents often maintained similar patterns as adults. Attachments could be intense but exclusive, and social circles were frequently curated to accommodate personal habits or sensitivities. Courtiers quickly learned to navigate these nuances, adjusting daily life to align with royal preference. Physical eccentricities often persisted as well. Monarchs with delicate health or minor deformities in adolescence might continue to require special accommodations. Seating arrangements, ceremonial positions, and furniture design were often adapted to suit comfort or ritual. Observers noted these peculiarities politely, emphasizing dignity and decorum, but the underlying cause frequently traced back to adolescent development under unusual pressure. Even personal rituals could carry generational echoes. Monarchs might insist that ceremonies, correspondence, or religious observances follow routines established during formative years. A queen's nightly prayers, a king's dressing rituals, or a monarch's reading habits often reflected deeply ingrained habits from teenage life. These behaviors, simultaneously practical and symbolic, reinforced personal control while shaping the rhythms of courtly life. Importantly, these continuities reveal a quiet human truth. The adolescent experience, structured, constrained, and closely observed, left an indelible mark on royal psychology. Teen monarchs learned to cope, adapt, and assert individuality in subtle ways. These strategies, refined and ritualized, became adult eccentricities, influencing governance, public perception, and daily life. History often records these behaviors with polite detachment, but the human story behind them is compelling, gently absurd, and quietly relatable. Even seemingly minor eccentricities could have historical resonance. A king's obsession with precise daily routine could dictate the timing of meetings, the flow of governance, or ceremonial scheduling. A queen's dietary quirks might shape courtly etiquette or influence the selection of attendants. Adolescent eccentricities carried into adulthood created ripple effects in both public and private life, demonstrating how small personal habits can influence historical context in subtle ways. And yet, despite these eccentricities, monarchs often maintained public composure and ceremonial decorum. Teen strategies, obsessive routines, private coping mechanisms, selective social engagement provided tools for managing the pressures of adult rule. Eccentricities became both shield and signature, a way to preserve personal stability while projecting authority, dignity, and control to the outside world. In short, adult monarchs were, in many ways, teenage monarchs grown larger, more ritualized, and more publicly scrutinized. Adolescent habits, quirks, and coping mechanisms often persisted quietly into adulthood, shaping personal life, courtly structure, and even historical legacy. What began as coping with isolation, expectation, and responsibility became a defining pattern of adult behavior. Eccentric, disciplined, and quietly fascinating. As we pause tonight's reflection, consider this. Behind every crown is a life shaped long before the throne was fully assumed. Teen habits, obsessive routines, eccentric preferences, private rituals, and subtle emotional coping matured into adult eccentricities that defined reign, courtly life, and legacy. The story of monarchy, then, is not just one of power, politics, or conquest. It is also the story of human adaptation, persistence, and the gentle absurdity of daily life under immense pressure. And with that, we'll close Part 9. In the next part, we'll explore the enduring impact of eccentric monarchs on courtly life, ceremonial ritual, and historical memory, continuing our slow, slightly snarky journey through the quietly peculiar world of royalty.
Part 10. Eccentric Monarchs and the Legacy of Courtly Ritual. Welcome back, friends, for the final stretch. If you're still nestled comfortably, perhaps wrapped in a blanket and ready to drift gently, let's slowly float into the lingering echoes of royal eccentricity, how the habits, obsessions, and quirks of monarchs shaped courtly life, and how history remembers them. By now, we've followed young monarchs through adolescence, teen pressures, arranged marriages, dynastic inbreeding, and subtle emotional struggles. We've observed how these elements created eccentricities that often persisted into adulthood. Now we see the ripple effects, how these personal quirks influenced ceremony, daily routines, and even how history later perceived them. Take Louis XIV again. The Sun King's obsession with routine and ceremony dictated court life at Versailles for decades. From the timing of meals to the order of dress, everything revolved around his preferences. Courtiers learned to anticipate moods, follow schedules precisely, and participate in elaborate rituals designed to showcase royal order. Louis's eccentricities, born from teenage habits of structure and attention to detail, effectively became the framework for governance. He transformed personal idiosyncrasy into a subtle form of control over an entire court. Similarly, Charles VI of France left a different kind of mark. His emotional fragility, eccentric behaviors, and periodic instability shaped not only daily life at court, but also the perception of monarchy in France. Attendants, advisors, and historians were compelled to accommodate quirks while maintaining the dignity of the crown. Furniture arrangements, ceremonial roles, and daily routines were all subtly adjusted to reflect the monarch's needs.
In this way, personal eccentricity became a lens through which history later interpreted his reign. Even smaller-scale eccentricities had historical impact. Monarchs who carried adolescent obsessions into adulthood, whether with books, rituals, clothing, or personal schedules, often influenced court etiquette in ways that outlasted them. A queen's insistence on a particular bedtime ritual or a king's obsession with a daily procession might seem trivial, but over decades, these preferences structured the daily rhythm of governance. Historians looking back may note these quirks with polite detachment, but their influence on courtly culture was profound. Courtly etiquette, in many ways, was a mirror of monarchs' private eccentricities. Rules for seating, bowing, correspondence, and ceremonial participation were often developed to accommodate personal quirks. A monarch's obsession with cleanliness, diet, or posture could dictate complex protocols for attendants and visitors alike. In a subtly absurd way, royal eccentricities became the organizing principle for centuries of court ritual. Teen habits and private coping strategies matured into structural norms, blending personal idiosyncrasy with institutional formality. Letters and diaries provide fascinating glimpses of the interaction between eccentricity and historical memory. Chroniclers often recorded minor quirks with gentle amusement. A king refusing a meal at a precise time, a queen insisting on repetitive daily rituals, or a monarch performing unusual devotional practices. These descriptions were polite but informative, hinting at both the personal reality of royal life and the social accommodations necessary to sustain it. Through these observations, history preserves not just events, but personality, atmosphere, and the subtle comedy of court life. Dynastic inbreeding, as discussed earlier, left both physical and behavioral traces. Adult eccentricities often intersected with inherited quirks, shaping the expectations of courtiers, advisors, and family members. A monarch's dietary obsession might be amplified by delicate health. A ruler's compulsive attention to ritual might stem from a blend of inherited temperament and adolescent training. Over time, these quirks influenced succession planning, ceremonial order, and even political alliances, subtly directing the course of history in ways that are quietly fascinating. Interestingly, eccentricity also influenced the ceremonial performance of grief, celebration, and religious devotion. Monarchs who developed obsessive or structured habits in adolescence often ritualized public displays of mourning, festival participation, or religious observance. What might appear ceremonial or symbolic on the surface was often deeply intertwined with personal habit and long-standing coping mechanisms. Courtiers learned to interpret subtle cues, manage appearances, and navigate ritualized eccentricity with remarkable skill. Legacy, then, is shaped not just by political achievement, but by personal peculiarity. Historians, looking back, often describe monarchs in terms of their quirks: the meticulous Louis XIV, the melancholy Charles VI, the eccentric Habsburgs. These descriptors are not merely anecdotal. They reflect the lived reality of palace life, where teen habits matured into adult routines, emotional pressures manifested as rituals, and private eccentricities became public structures. History remembers personality because it shaped governance, ritual, and perception. Even minor habits, insisting on a particular chair, reading at precise hours, maintaining obsessive order in clothing, reverberated through court life. Over years, these personal routines created patterns that defined entire households. Generations of attendants, advisors, and courtiers learned to anticipate, accommodate, and subtly participate in these eccentricities. Personal quirks became institutionalized in a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm of daily life that historians can still trace centuries later. The broader lesson is quietly human. Monarchy is not just a story of crowns, wars, or alliances. It is also a story of individuals navigating expectation, responsibility, and personal temperament. Teenagers grown into rulers, adolescent habits transformed into lifelong rituals, and eccentricities shaped not only their own lives, but the structure of entire courts. Subtle, persistent, often gently absurd quirks left an indelible mark on history, reminding us that human nature quietly influences events even in the grandest halls of power. So, as we slowly conclude tonight's exploration, imagine the scene. A court bustling with attendants, each movement choreographed around the habits of monarchs who were once timid teenagers, melancholy adolescents, and slightly awkward children. Every gesture, ritual, and routine reflects a lifetime of adaptation, coping, and personal eccentricity. Behind the pomp and ceremony lies the quietly fascinating story of human psychology, adolescent formation, and the gentle absurdity of life under a crown. And with that, we gently close our long, meandering journey through the eccentric, mildly tragic, and quietly absorbing world of medieval and early modern royalty. From awkward teenagers navigating arranged marriages to adult monarchs shaping courtly ritual with their lingering quirks, we've seen that history is as much about personality as it is about politics. These stories, gently absurd and subtly tragic, remind us that the human element endures behind every crown, throne, and palace wall. Good night, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you into restful dreams.